that I think gold will play an increasingly important role, or perhaps you should say resume an increasingly important role in global trade.
Yeah, Rick, always good to welcome you back on the show. Good to see you.
Daniela, my pleasure. Thank you for having me back on.
Yeah, well, we were saying offline, no shortage of news here. Few items if I had to choose, I want to address with you. Obviously, we're gonna tackle inflation. Want to get your thoughts on if you think a recession is imminent, given that yield curve that everyone's talking about. But first, there was an article that someone sent to me over the weekend, a mutual friend of ours, actually, Rick, and I thought this would make an interesting talking point here. And it has to do with the likelihood of a return to the gold standard. Are we on the edge of a new gold standard? And it is an article penned by Alistair MacLeod, where he writes that the Russians and Chinese will be acutely aware that Western currencies, particularly the yen and euro, are likely to be undermined by recent developments. The financial war, which has always been in the background, is emerging into plain sight and becoming a battlefield between fiat currencies, and it's full on. The winner by default is almost certainly gold, the only reliable reserve asset for those not aligned with Russia's unfriendliness. And he says it's still a long way from backing any currency, but the default winner would be gold. I want to get your thoughts. Is this a direction you think we're headed in? Does that make sense to you?
Well, it's a subtle question. I do think that a default winner is gold. It is one of the only, if not the only, financial asset that is both a medium of exchange, which is to say a money, but also an asset in and of itself rather than being a promise to pay. The renminbi, the dollar, the ruble are all really, in the end, promises to pay. But gold is in effect payment in and of itself. So I do believe that gold's prominence as a medium of exchange will increase as a consequence of unstable geopolitics, and increase too inadvertently because of the US government's decision to weaponize the US dollar and weaponize the SWIFT system. We've used the dollar's preeminence around the world. I say we advisedly. You and I both carry American passports. Our government has decided to weaponize our currency and our payments mechanism, taking advantage of the fact that the world is on a dollar standard to attempt to enforce American policy extraterritorially. Whether or not you agree with the direction of US policy, I think there is no doubt that there are a lot of countries and a lot of people around the world that don't appreciate the extraterritorial nature of US policy, and thus don't trust the US government and the US government's proxy, which is to say the US dollar. The consequence of that is that I think gold will play an increasingly important role, or perhaps you should say resume an increasingly important role in global trade. I don't believe that that leads any country to a gold standard. Those are very different circumstances. People become politicians because of a lust for power and a belief that their own policy alternatives are better than other people's policy alternatives. A gold standard is always a limit to a political system's power and a politician's power. So if you are a politician, the idea that your fiscal policy should be held hostage to gold, or that your ability to issue specious currency should be held hostage to gold, is to you a circumstance to be avoided at all cost. The idea, as an example, that Mr. Putin, were he on a gold standard, would be unable to affect fiscal policy in rubles, but rather would be tied to the flow of gold. Or the idea, for that matter, that Mr. Xi or Mr. Biden would voluntarily allow themselves to be constrained in that fashion by the, quote, barbarous relic, seems highly unlikely to me. So I think that, I mean, I don't see any reason why you and I couldn't be on our own gold standard and measure our purchases and sales in gold and do transactions between ourselves in gold. I think that the distributed ledger technology, the blockchain technology, is coming along very quickly, which will allow the tokenization of gold and the utilization of gold in small transactions and large. And I think that large transactions, as an example, by and between, say, Russia and India, or China and Indonesia, will become increasingly denominated in gold. But I don't think that you will see any fiat currency in the world tied to a gold standard simply because it limits the power of the political class.
Could you see a new reserve currency, digital in form, backed by gold?
I could see gold as part of a basket of assets, but the purpose of gold is sound money, and the concept of sound money and the concept of a powerful state are in direct opposition to each other. Reserve currencies that are made up of a basket of fiat currencies, so that a supranational organization like the World Bank or the United Nations could do the same type of fiscal policy and, frankly, the same type of counterfeiting that exists on an individual ad hoc basis today, might find real favor with the political class. It would give them another level of obfuscation, another way to divorce their power from what is good for you as an individual. So it wouldn't surprise me to see special drawing rights or some other basket of fiat currencies formed. But to the extent that you anchor that with gold, to the extent that you make it more stable, you remove policy options from policymakers and politicians. And that is as popular with them as AIDS.
Okay, two paths I want to go down. You brought up two very important points. Okay, first, let's touch a little more on the weaponization of the US dollar and the repercussions. How does this play out? Does that dethrone the US dollar down the road?
I definitely think it weakens the US dollar. There are large groups of people in the world, or at least leaders of large groups of people in the world, who don't believe that the US has the right to meddle in their internal affairs. Those might include Iran, they might include Saudi Arabia, they might include the Russians, they might include the Chinese, they might include the Indians. There are a broad group of people around the world, or at least leaders of broad groups of people, who believe that the United States is at best inconvenient with regards to their policy goals. And the US forcing of countries that disagree with the projection of US power to adhere to the US line or be kicked out of the SWIFT banking system, the payment system, is at once an extremely powerful tool for the United States and an obstacle to be avoided for other people. The idea, too, that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency almost assumes neutrality. The idea, as an example, that if Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, they have to do it in US dollars. And to the extent that the Japanese engaged in some policy alternative that they decided was in their own interest, and the US could then apply sanctions, eliminating the ability for them to trade and settle in dollars, which would obviate their ability, as an example, to buy oil, except at some extraordinary premium. I can understand how countries around the world would view the projection of US power through the currency as being an unnecessary and frankly unacceptable overreach.
If it were to weaken, and if that is the consequences, and what you've just said plays out, why make that move? Why make that move? Because they care? Because does the government really care about the greater good of the world? Is there something more at play? They didn't think about it? Why?
Your viewers are going to hate this. I don't believe that, given the fact that the U.S. defense budget is larger than the next 10 largest nations in the world combined, that they care too much about humankind and care much more about the projection of U.S. power. They may believe they're right, they may believe they're wrong, but they aren't particularly interested in the inputs of other parties. I believe, too, that the United States government, and perhaps by extension the United States voters, have a basic lack of knowledge of economics and don't care too much about economics. I believe that policy goals are more important to the power structure in the US and the power structure in other countries than the laws of basic economics. Think, for example, Daniela, about a topic I'm sure we'll discuss later in this interview, negative real interest rates. The policy by which you penalize savers, you penalize investors on behalf of spenders. The promulgation of negative real interest rates indicates two things: a very, very, very short-term outlook and a lack of understanding of the basic fairness of economics. The idea that a young person like you, who saves, who generates more utility than she consumes, lending that surplus to me so that I can consume today, and receiving payment later that has less purchasing power than the purchasing power that she sacrificed by making the loan today, is not a force of nature. It's a construct. It's a government construct. And I would suggest to you that the same policymakers who believe in negative real interest rates believe in the weaponization of the currency. I believe that they either have a lack of knowledge of basic economics, or more probably, that their near-term policy goals for them are much more important than maintaining a fair economy for you and I and for Russians and for Chinese and for Indians.